So now I can just start clicking and dragging, bringing in my frames, again, referencing my cue sheet. As a matter of fact, let's see if I can bring both of those up at the same time. So one at a time, I'll click and drag these into my timeline. So this is my first shot, and I want this to last probably about 4 seconds. So on my timeline here, I can just click and drag my current time indicator over to about the 4-second mark. I can see that on the time ruler here. I can also see the time code up in the upper left of the timeline panel. And there's a few different ways I can handle this. I like to use a keyboard shortcut here when I'm trying to basically trim off some extra time. So to the left of the time indicator is the segment I want to keep. To the right is what I want to chop off. Since this is a still image, I can really chop this wherever I want, and it's going to be the same. It's not like a piece of video or a piece of sound where it's going to depend on where in the sequence I make a cut. So on my keyboard, I'm just going to hit Alt or Option, and then the right bracket key. So when I do that, it sets the end point of that layer wherever the current time indicator is. Okay, and so I'm looking back to my cue sheet. I can see that I want this to do a boom moving down. So actually, I think I meant moving up. So I wanted to move something like this, where this part of the image is sort of creeping upwards. So let's go ahead and set some position keyframes in order to sort of simulate that camera motion. So I'll go ahead and click on my layer here. And actually, before I do that, let's rename this. So I can right click and rename. And when I'm setting the layer name here, it's not actually overwriting the file name. It's just letting me sort of be a little bit more clear. Then I can either click down and expand into the transform properties, or just with that layer highlighted, I can click P on the keyboard and jump right to position. So I'm going to click the little stopwatch next to position. It's going to make that property keyframeable or animatable. And it's also going to give us a keyframe where the current time indicator was. So you want to make sure that your time indicator is set wherever you want that camera motion to start. So I want it to start right at the beginning of that layer. And so by the time we get to the 4-second mark, I want this to move up in the viewport. So in my position settings, I've got the horizontal position and the vertical position. I'm just going to click and drag here. And you can see as I go left to right, I'll be moving that up or down. So something like that. Let's go ahead and just play that back. And obviously, when we're looking at the cue sheet, these durations, these are my best guess. So I don't necessarily know that this needs to be exactly 4 seconds. So I can really easily make adjustments to the timing here. Let's say I want this to be more like 6 seconds. I can click and drag on the end of that layer. And I can also click and drag and move that second position keyframe. So I'm finding that I want this to last a little bit longer. And I think that's a pretty good start. What I am envisioning, though, for this is a motion that's a little bit jerky. So right now this is very smooth. I want it to be more like something like this, where there's like a little bit of a pause in between each motion. So one way that I can start to execute that is, let's move a little bit down that timeline. And I'd like to insert a keyframe. So I do that by clicking the diamond all the way at the left of that position property. So that's going to set a position keyframe. And what I want is to move a little bit, maybe a few frames down the timeline, but I want to repeat that keyframe so it's holding the position from here to here. So right now, this keyframe is selected, it's blue. So I'm just going to hit Edit Copy, or on my keyboard either Command C or Control C, and then Command V or Control V, and I'll paste that keyframe right at the current time indicator. So right now I'll be moving from the starting position up and then holding. Or actually, it looks like it's bouncing a little bit for some reason. I'm not sure why it's doing that. So when we're troubleshooting motion like this, we can sort of switch the view from keyframes to what's called the graph editor. And so what I do to activate that is click this little icon that is in between the property name and the keyframe stopwatch. And then let's switch to our graph editor view. And in this graph editor, basically, I get some more advanced options for how I want motion to happen. And this is where we deal with things like spacing, things like acceleration, things like easing, is through the graph editor. So let's go ahead and convert the selected keyframes to hold. So I'm just clicking on that keyframe to highlight it. And there we can see now, rather than that little dip going down, I get a straight line. And so what we're seeing here in the graph editor is the value of the property that we're keyframing over time. So I can see my position, it's starting up here relatively high, about 1700 pixels. As we scroll down the timeline, it's going down to about 161 pixels. So we can see here visually the way that it's varying over time. So let's play that back. I'm just hitting the space bar. And actually, maybe I don't want it to just hold static. So I'm going to go ahead and undo. I actually kind of like that little bounce. So let's see if we can, use that happy accident to get a little bit more interesting effect as we're moving this image. And so I just want to sort of repeat that same strategy of letting that boom move up a little bit, setting a keyframe, moving a few frames down, copying that selected keyframe, and then pasting right to wherever the playhead is. It's a rough approximation of what I'd like to do. I'm finding that I want this to last even longer than I was anticipating. So let's drag this out to about 10 seconds. So I'm just clicking and dragging on the end of the layer. And now I've got all these keyframes. I've got them roughly in sort of a configuration that I want to keep, but I want to move them all to sort of match the duration of the layer. So obviously I could, click and drag and move them individually. I'm going to undo that. But in this case, I'm going to select all of them. So I'm just clicking and dragging, drawing a box around all those keyframes, and then holding down Alt or Option on the keyboard, I'll click and drag. And you can see now they're all going to stretch out in proportion with one another. So that's a nice way to be flexible, starting to make some more sophisticated keyframe animations, but still being able to adjust the overall duration. So sort of separating the timing from the spacing. So I'm just going to go ahead and spend some time getting in all of my shots, and then we'll work on fine-tuning a few more.